Archduchess Gisela Louise Marie of Austria was born on July 12, 1856, at Laxenburg Castle, just outside Vienna. She was the second child of Emperor Franz Joseph I and Empress Elisabeth, a couple whose names would become synonymous with the grandeur and ultimate downfall of the Habsburg dynasty. Today, the Habsburg family is remembered as a symbol of European monarchy, imperial power, and a turbulent decline marked by dramatic public tragedy. But before they were icons of an empire in crisis, the Habsburgs were a family shaped by internal distance, personal sacrifice, and the silent endurance of its lesser-known members. Gisela's early years unfolded behind palace walls, far from the attention later focused on her famous mother and her ill-fated brother, Crown Prince Rudolph. Her life story traces a path from imperial daughterhood through strategic marriage to a quieter form of royal service and adaptation amid eras of transformation and loss. This account follows her journey from her birth, through her roles in Vienna and Munich, to the aftermath of imperial collapse. Before we begin, please comment where in the world you're watching from. I'd love to know that this story is being watched from all around the globe. Gisela was the second child of Franz Joseph and Empress Elisabeth, following the birth of Archduchess Sophie in 1855. Her position within the family hierarchy was immediately defined by succession law and court custom. As a daughter without direct claim to the throne, her future role was understood in terms of dynastic utility rather than political authority. From infancy, she was placed under the supervision of court-appointed nurses and tutors rather than raised within a private family setting. This arrangement reflected standard Habsburg practice, which prioritized institutional continuity over parental involvement. The imperial household in which Gisela spent her early years was governed by rigid schedules and strict behavioral expectations. Daily life followed ceremonial routines that emphasized discipline, religious observance, and deference to rank. Decisions regarding education, residence, and companionship were made by senior court officials acting on behalf of the emperor. Empress Elisabeth, still adjusting to her role and openly uncomfortable with court life, remained emotionally and physically distant from her children during this period. As a result, Gisela's early development occurred largely without maternal presence, a circumstance documented in correspondence between court administrators. Vienna and its surrounding estates served as the geographic center of Gisela's early life. Laxenburg Castle, where she was born, functioned as a seasonal retreat and a controlled environment for the imperial family. Despite its relative seclusion, the residence remained embedded within the broader machinery of empire. Diplomatic visitors, military officials, and extended family members circulated through the estate, reinforcing Gisela's early exposure to formal hierarchy. Her upbringing was shaped less by affection than by institutional expectation. The political context of Gisela's birth also influenced the structure of her childhood. Franz Joseph's administration emphasized stability after decades of upheaval, and the imperial family was expected to embody continuity and restraint. Public appearances of the emperor and empress were carefully managed, and the private lives of their children were similarly regulated. Gisela's presence at ceremonial events was limited, reflecting her secondary status within the line of succession. Nevertheless, her existence carried symbolic weight as part of the dynasty's future. By the late 1850s, the Habsburg court had settled into a pattern of governance that relied heavily on tradition and centralized authority. Gisela's earliest years coincided with this consolidation, reinforcing her position within a system resistant to personal expression. Educational plans drafted for her emphasized language acquisition, religious instruction, and comportment, with little attention given to emotional development. These decisions were not anomalous, but consistent with the treatment of imperial daughters across Europe. The circumstances of Gisela's birth and early childhood established the framework that would shape her entire life. Positioned at the center of empire, yet removed from its decision-making core, she was prepared from the beginning for a role defined by duty and discretion. These conditions did not signal tragedy, but rather the quiet marginalization typical of many royal women within 19th century dynastic structures. The patterns set during these years would continue to influence her relationships, responsibilities, and historical visibility in the decades that followed. Gisela's early childhood, spanning from the late 1850s through the early 1860s, unfolded almost entirely within the confines of the Habsburg court, a world defined by intricate etiquette and careful management of appearances. The routines established by court protocol determined nearly every aspect of her daily life. The Archduchess was placed under the supervision of Baroness Louise von Sturmfeder, a governess previously entrusted with the upbringing of her older sister Sophie and later her brother Rudolf. Sturmfeder's role extended beyond that of a caretaker. She was responsible for enforcing discipline, overseeing education, and maintaining a careful distance between the children and their parents in accordance with the wishes of both Emperor Franz Joseph and the formidable Archduchess Sophie, Gisela's grandmother. Instruction began at an early age, with lessons in French, Hungarian, and Italian, alongside a focus on Catholic doctrine and the rituals associated with court religious observance. By the age of 5, Gisela could recite prayers in multiple languages and was expected to participate in daily mass with her family and household staff. Her schedule included periods of structured play, supervised reading, and time spent outdoors within the secure boundaries of the imperial gardens at Schönbrunn and Laxenburg. Court records from the period show a strict allocation of time for each activity, monitored and reported in detail to the Empress and her mother-in-law. The emotional climate of Gisela's childhood was defined by formality and restraint. Empress Elisabeth, often preoccupied with her own physical health and increasingly uncomfortable with the rigid expectations of court life, delegated most maternal responsibilities to her mother-in-law and to appointed staff. Personal letters from Elisabeth reveal her dissatisfaction with this arrangement, yet she acquiesced to established custom. Gisela's relationship with her mother remained distant, limited to carefully arranged encounters and public appearances. The emotional bonds typically found within a family setting were replaced by loyalty to the dynasty and adherence to established hierarchy. Her brother, Rudolf, born in 1858, quickly became the central focus of the household's attention due to his position as heir to the throne. The educational resources, tutors, and daily interactions provided to Rudolf reflected the dynasty's concern for its future. Gisela, meanwhile, continued her studies under the guidance of the same instructors, but was prepared for a very different path, one that would center on her value as a potential bride for a member of another European royal house. This divergence in upbringing and expectation became evident by the time Gisela reached the age of 8, as documented in household reports and the correspondence of court officials. The court's insistence on rigid discipline and social distance was not unique to Gisela's experience, but characteristic of Habsburg methods. During the 19th century, children of the imperial family were rarely permitted unsupervised interaction with outsiders or with each other. Opportunities for informal play or emotional intimacy were strictly regulated. Family gatherings, when they occurred, were conducted as formal events with prescribed seating, conversation topics, and durations. These customs, reinforced over generations, shaped Gisela's social development and would influence her approach to relationships throughout her life. By the mid-1860s, as political tensions mounted across the empire and new demands were placed upon Emperor Franz Joseph, the routines governing Gisela's upbringing remained unchanged. The imperial household prioritized continuity and stability above all, a principle that extended to the management of its youngest members. Gisela's world was that of a carefully enclosed system where duty eclipsed personal desire and where identity was defined by institutional priorities rather than individual preference. The cumulative effect of these formative years was the development of a temperament characterized by composure, discipline, and reserve. Gisela acquired the ability to adapt to changing circumstances without outward display of emotion, a quality that would become increasingly important as she faced the transitions and losses that marked her adult life. The order and detachment of her Habsburg childhood shaped her worldview, prepared her for the role she would assume beyond Vienna, and reinforced the pattern of personal restraint that would remain central to her historical identity. Gisela's relationship with her mother, Empress Elisabeth, during the 1860s and 1870s, was defined by distance, both emotional and physical, imposed by court custom and Elizabeth's own temperament. From the earliest years of Gisela's life, records show that Empress Elisabeth found the Viennese court environment confining and sought relief through extended absences, often spending months at health resorts or traveling to foreign destinations. Correspondence from this period, including letters exchanged between Elisabeth and her confidants, documents her reluctance to participate in courtly routines and her tendency to withdraw from her children's daily lives. Despite the restrictions of court protocol, Elizabeth's influence on Gisela's upbringing was not absent. The Empress intervened on specific matters of health and education when her convictions conflicted with those of her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, or the court-appointed guardians. Notably, in the mid-1860s, Elizabeth insisted on less rigid dietary regimes for her daughter and lobbied for brief periods of less structured activity. However, these interventions remained exceptions. The prevailing pattern was one of limited contact, with most daily decisions delegated to the hierarchy established within the Habsburg household. Elizabeth's ambivalence toward motherhood reflected her broader discomfort with imperial obligations. The Empress's diaries and the recollections of court officials repeatedly describe her preference for solitude and her preoccupation with personal pursuits, including physical fitness, poetry, and her well-documented fascination with Hungary. These interests took her away from Vienna for extended periods, as evidenced by her lengthy sojourns in Bad Ischl, Corfu, and Madeira throughout the late 1850s and 1860s. During these absences, Gisela's welfare was overseen by Baroness Sturmfeder and a rotating staff of tutors, religious instructors, and physicians. Gisela's emotional development during these years occurred largely in the context of these substitute relationships. Letters from her early governesses and tutors describe a reserved and adaptable child, responsive to discipline but rarely expressing overt affection. Court records do not suggest any incidents of open rebellion or discord between Gisela and her mother, but the relationship remained largely formal and characterized by infrequent, ceremonially staged interactions. Portrait sittings, official family outings, and appearances at imperial functions provided opportunities for public demonstration of familial unity. But behind these events, distance persisted. As Gisela entered adolescence, the emotional pattern established in her early childhood continued. By the time she reached the age of 12, her mother's attentions were increasingly focused on Crown Prince Rudolf, whose sensitive disposition and eventual struggles attracted Elizabeth's sympathy and concern. Gisela, while present in family events and ceremonies, received less individualized attention. Archival sources, including the Empress's letters and official calendars, confirmed that Gisela's presence was often noted at imperial occasions, but private time with her mother remained rare and brief. This pattern of distance did not result in overt estrangement, but it shaped Gisela's character and her approach to relationships in later life. The combination of institutional upbringing and limited maternal contact reinforced a disposition toward self-reliance and emotional reserve. Gisela learned to navigate the complexities of the Habsburg household by adhering to protocol and fulfilling her expected duties without seeking or expecting intimacy. The model presented by her mother, of withdrawal, select involvement, and a focus on personal pursuits, provided a reference point for Gisela's own conduct, especially after her transition to married life. By the late 1860s, the rhythm of Elizabeth's visits, combined with her absences, had become a defining feature of the imperial household. While court chroniclers continued to document family events for public consumption, the underlying reality was one of separation. Gisela's relationship with her mother thus exemplifies the broader challenges faced by royal children raised within rigid systems, where personal bonds were often subordinate to ceremonial and institutional demands. The lasting effect of Elisabeth's presence and absence was evident in Gisela's later decisions, and her consistent preference for duty over emotional display. The pattern established in childhood provided both a limitation and a foundation, equipping Gisela with the skills necessary to adapt to the expectations of royal marriage and to navigate the evolving circumstances of her adult years. The influence of Empress Elisabeth, subtle but enduring, remained present in Gisela's approach to family, responsibility, and the public dimensions of her life. By the early 1870s, the priorities of the Habsburg dynasty required that Gisela's future be shaped in accordance with the empire's strategic interests. At 16 years of age, Gisela was selected for a marriage alliance that would strengthen ties between the Austrian and Bavarian royal houses. Negotiations began in earnest in late 1872 and involved direct correspondence between Emperor Franz Joseph I and King Ludwig II of Bavaria. The chosen bridegroom was Prince Leopold of Bavaria, a member of the Wittelsbach dynasty, and an officer in the Bavarian army. This selection followed long-standing patterns within European royalty, where marriages functioned as extensions of diplomatic policy rather than personal preference. The arrangement of Gisela's marriage was handled with the same procedural formality that governed all significant events in the Habsburg court. An engagement announcement was issued in early 1873, and preparations commenced for a ceremony in Vienna. Court records document the extensive administrative effort required for such an alliance, including legal agreements on dowry, property rights, and the terms of Gisela's transition from the Austrian to the Bavarian court. These documents, preserved in both Vienna and Munich, detail negotiations regarding religious observance, household staffing, and the retention of certain ceremonial privileges for Gisela after her marriage. In April of 1873, Gisela and Prince Leopold were formally wed at the Augustinian Church in Vienna, with the ceremony attended by the major figures of the Habsburg and Wittelsbach dynasties, as well as diplomatic representatives from across Europe. The event was publicized in the international press, and contemporary accounts describe the wedding as a display of imperial unity and stability. Gisela, accompanied by her parents and siblings, participated in a series of public rituals, including a procession through the streets of Vienna and receptions at the Hofburg Palace. Photographs and press reports from the period underscore the ceremonial nature of the occasion and the dynastic significance attributed to the match. The transition to married life for Gisela was immediate and comprehensive. Within weeks of the wedding, she departed Vienna for Munich, escorted by a retinue of Habsburg officials and Bavarian dignitaries. The protocols surrounding her departure reflected both the gravity and the finality of her new role. Correspondence from family members and court staff confirmed that Gisela's relocation was viewed as a duty fulfilled rather than a personal achievement. Upon arrival in Munich, she was formally introduced to the Wittelsbach court and installed at the prince's residence, where her duties as Princess of Bavaria commenced without delay. Gisela's marriage to Prince Leopold did not mark a dramatic rupture from her upbringing, but rather an extension of the values and expectations instilled during her years in Vienna. Her new responsibilities centered on the management of a royal household, participation in ceremonial events, and the cultivation of ties with local institutions. Records from the Bavarian court indicate that Gisela's adjustment was facilitated by her prior experience with court protocol, her command of languages, and her understanding of the political dimensions of her new position. She engaged with charitable organizations, supported military and civic functions, and quickly became integrated into the social fabric of Munich's aristocracy. The strategic objectives of Gisela's marriage were realized through increased cooperation between the Habsburg and Wittelsbach dynasties during the subsequent years. The union provided an avenue for regular diplomatic contact and reinforced mutual interests in the shifting political landscape of post-unification Germany. While contemporary observers often commented on the personal compatibility of the couple, official documentation and surviving correspondence consistently frame the marriage in terms of its political and dynastic consequences. In the spring of 1873, Archduchess Gisela began her life as Princess Leopold of Bavaria. Following the elaborate wedding ceremonies in Vienna, Gisela departed for Munich accompanied by an official delegation and select members of her family. The journey itself, documented in Bavarian and Austrian press coverage, was an event designed to reinforce the unity between the two dynasties. Upon arrival in Munich, Gisela was received with public festivities, including processions through the city, a formal welcome at the royal palace, and receptions hosted by members of the Wittelsbach family. The adaptation to her new environment was immediate. The Bavarian royal household, while similar in many respects to Vienna's imperial court, maintained its own protocols, traditions, and social networks. Gisela was assigned apartments at the Munich residence and introduced to the ladies of the court, who assisted in her transition. The responsibilities of her position required rapid adjustment. Within weeks, she presided over charitable committees, attended court functions, and represented the Wittelsbach dynasty at religious and civic events. The structure of daily life remained governed by protocol and routine, but Gisela's role now included direct oversight of domestic affairs. Her marriage to Prince Leopold produced 4 children, Elisabeth, August, Georg, and Conrad, over the following decade. Contemporary accounts in Bavarian newspapers and official chronicles record Gisela's active involvement in her children's upbringing, consistent with the expectations for a royal consort. She managed a household that balanced Habsburg formality with the more regional customs favored in Bavaria. Letters exchanged between Gisela and her parents reveal an ongoing connection to her Austrian family, though visits were infrequent and formal. Her correspondence shows a practical approach to family management, emphasizing order, health, and religious observance. Public life in Munich demanded participation in numerous organizations. Gisela's calendar in the 1870s and 1880s included regular attendance at meetings of hospital boards, orphanages, and philanthropic societies. Her support for the Bavarian Red Cross and other charitable institutions was documented in the minutes of these organizations and reported in the Munich press. Unlike some royal contemporaries, Gisela approached these commitments as ongoing duties rather than opportunities for personal promotion. The historical record includes numerous instances of her administrative contributions, from fundraising to event planning and policy oversight. Relations with her husband, Prince Leopold, were cordial and cooperative, shaped by shared expectations rather than personal sentiment. Prince Leopold's military career and periodic absences placed much of the household's daily management in Gisela's hands. She maintained regular correspondence with him during his deployments and received official briefings from court officials when he was stationed outside Munich. The couple's interactions, preserved in formal records and private letters, demonstrate mutual respect and adherence to established roles. Gisela's adaptation to Bavarian society was marked by a conscious effort to integrate without undermining her Habsburg identity. She attended religious ceremonies at both Catholic and Protestant institutions, participated in regional festivals, and maintained contact with members of the Austrian court. Her ability to balance these dual affiliations was noted by contemporaries and contributed to her steady public profile. This approach reflected her training as an imperial daughter and her understanding of the importance of public representation in maintaining dynastic alliances. The first decade of Gisela's life in Munich established the foundations for her subsequent role in Bavarian society. Through her management of household affairs, commitment to civic and charitable activities, and careful cultivation of public and private relationships, she exemplified the virtues expected of a princess in the late 19th century. The structures of duty and decorum that had shaped her childhood continued to define her conduct, but the Munich years allowed for a greater measure of personal agency within the constraints of royal life. The consequences of her adaptation would become more pronounced as the political and social context of Europe shifted in the decades that followed. By the late 1870s, Gisela had fully established herself within Munich society, a process driven by her consistent engagement with local institutions and her visible commitment to civic duty. The expectations placed upon a Princess of Bavaria required public participation beyond ceremonial functions. Archival records from the period, including annual reports of charitable organizations and minutes from hospital board meetings, indicate Gisela's regular attendance and administrative involvement. She quickly became an active member of the Bavarian Red Cross, supporting its initiatives during peacetime and periods of public health crisis. Gisela's approach to philanthropy was distinguished by its emphasis on practicality and direct oversight. She reviewed financial accounts, attended planning sessions, and advocated for the expansion of services in children's hospitals and orphanages. Contemporary press coverage, such as articles published in the Münchner Neueste Nachrichten, reported on her visits to local institutions, where she met with administrators, patients, and staff. These appearances were not simply symbolic. Gisela was known to inquire into operational details and support policy reforms. Her name appeared on the rosters of multiple organizations, including committees devoted to tuberculosis prevention and the education of disadvantaged youth. The religious dimension of Gisela's public work was also notable. As a devout Catholic, she supported the construction and restoration of churches in Munich and the surrounding region. Diocesan archives from the 1880s contain correspondence between Gisela and local clergy, documenting her financial contributions and her attendance at cornerstone-laying ceremonies. Her role extended to patronage of religious festivals, and she was regularly photographed at processions and major feast days, reinforcing the connection between the royal family and the city's Catholic identity. At the same time, her public appearances remained measured, and she avoided cultivating a personal cult or dramatic public persona. As her children grew older, Gisela balanced her public work with responsibilities at home. Court records and contemporary accounts describe a well-run household characterized by efficiency, discipline, and limited extravagance. The operation of the Munich residence depended on her management of staff, budgeting, and the supervision of family events. Letters exchanged between Gisela and her husband during his military assignments reflect her careful oversight of family finances and her pragmatic responses to the challenges of managing a royal household. The balance between public and private duties became a defining feature of her life during this period. The years following German unification brought social and economic change to Bavaria, including the rise of industrialization and shifts in municipal government. Gisela responded to these developments by supporting organizations that addressed new forms of poverty and health challenges. She endorsed local efforts to provide vocational training for women and contributed to early initiatives aimed at improving public hygiene. Official recognition of her work came in the form of honors bestowed by the city of Munich and commendations from charitable institutions. These awards, documented in city records and court bulletins, reflected the respect accorded to Gisela by both officials and the general population. Throughout the late 19th century, Gisela maintained her involvement in Munich's civic life without seeking undue publicity. Press reports typically described her as conscientious, disciplined, and approachable in her dealings with colleagues and beneficiaries. Her public reputation rested on the tangible impact of her efforts rather than self-promotion. By aligning her activities with the evolving needs of Bavarian society, she contributed to the gradual modernization of royal charity and established a model for royal involvement in civic affairs that persisted into the early 20th century. By the turn of the century, Gisela's position as a respected public figure in Munich was secure. Her commitment to civic and charitable duties was recognized both locally and within broader royal circles. The structures of public service she had established served not only her immediate family but also set a standard for subsequent generations of the Bavarian royal household. This phase of her life demonstrated the practical application of the values instilled during her Habsburg upbringing, as well as her ability to adapt to the demands of a rapidly changing society. In late January of 1889, news of the Mayerling incident reached Munich, where Archduchess Gisela had by then been established as Princess Leopold of Bavaria for nearly 16 years. The sudden death of Crown Prince Rudolf, her only brother, and heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, initiated a period of crisis for the Habsburg dynasty. Official dispatches from Vienna confirmed the discovery of Rudolph's body, alongside that of Baroness Mary Wetzera, at the Mayerling hunting lodge, and within hours, the imperial court entered formal mourning. Gisela, who had last seen her brother during family gatherings in Vienna, received the news through diplomatic channels and immediate family correspondence. Records from both the Viennese and Bavarian courts document Gisela's response as measured and reserved. Letters sent by Gisela to her parents, preserved in the Habsburg family archives, focused on condolences and practical support, avoiding emotional commentary. She arranged for masses to be said in Munich for Rudolph's soul and ensured that her own household observed mourning protocol according to both Habsburg and Wittelsbach tradition. Reports in the Munich press noted her presence at religious services and her absence from public events during the official mourning period. The Mayerling tragedy drew the attention of the entire European press and generated widespread speculation regarding the circumstances of Rudolph's death. Gisela, however, remained outside the main sphere of public scrutiny, her role defined by private family responsibilities and her position in Munich. Contemporary accounts highlight the contrast between the overwhelming grief of her mother, Empress Elisabeth, and Gisela's careful adherence to ceremonial obligations. The correspondence between Gisela and her parents during this period indicates a focus on managing the practicalities of grief, arranging memorials, attending required services, and communicating with extended family, rather than engaging in the public dimensions of dynastic tragedy. Gisela's personal relationship with her brother had always been shaped by the routines and hierarchies of their upbringing. In adulthood, their paths diverged. Rudolph's life became increasingly dominated by political and personal pressures as heir apparent, while Gisela assumed her duties in Bavaria. While their contact as adults was limited to formal visits and family celebrations, the bond of shared upbringing and status as imperial children was not absent from her correspondence. Nonetheless, the available evidence does not indicate any direct involvement by Gisela in the events leading to or following Rudolph's death. Her position at the periphery of the crisis was dictated as much by geography as by the roles assigned to women in the family's public narrative. The aftermath of Mayerling altered the Habsburg line of succession and intensified scrutiny of imperial family dynamics. Gisela, whose role had always been secondary to that of her brother, now found herself further removed from the center of dynastic affairs. The crisis reinforced the distinction between public and private life for royal women, as her contributions to the family response remained largely invisible to the broader public. She fulfilled the expectations of mourning, managed her family's observance of rituals, and continued her civic commitments in Munich as soon as official protocol allowed. In Munich, Gisela's responsibilities resumed quickly. By the spring of 1889, she received an Elisabethan Commemoration. She had returned to her charitable activities and public duties, as documented in records of the Bavarian Red Cross and reports in the local press. The Mayerling tragedy marked a decisive event in her family's history, but Gisela's role in its aftermath was defined by discretion, order, and a steady continuation of her established pattern of service. She remained a peripheral yet reliable figure, supporting her parents and maintaining the stability of her own household during one of the Habsburg dynasty's most consequential crises. The consequences of Mayerling for Gisela's personal and public life were thus measured. Her approach reflected the values ingrained during her upbringing and demonstrated the adaptability that would characterize her response to subsequent challenges. As the dynasty absorbed the shock of succession changes and ongoing scrutiny, Gisela's conduct during the crisis established a precedent for how she would navigate future periods of instability, both within her family and in the broader context of European royalty. As the 19th century drew toward its close, Europe entered an era of accelerated transformation marked by rising nationalism, economic modernization, and shifts in political power. Within this context, Gisela's life in Munich remained defined by consistency and public duty, even as the world around her changed rapidly. The unification of Germany under Prussian leadership in the 1870s and the subsequent consolidation of the German Empire in the 1880s altered the political landscape of Central Europe. Bavaria, while retaining a measure of autonomy, was now integrated into a broader imperial structure, with the Bavarian royal family expected to balance regional identity and new federal responsibilities. For Gisela, these years were characterized by a steady continuation of her established commitments. She remained deeply involved in civic and charitable organizations, frequently chairing meetings, overseeing hospital expansions, and sponsoring initiatives in education and public health. Archival records from the 1890s confirm her ongoing leadership in the Munich branch of the Red Cross and regular participation in religious and municipal events. Her approach to these duties remained pragmatic, focusing on organizational stability and practical outcomes rather than public spectacle. Letters exchanged with city officials and church leaders document her advocacy for improvements in social services, especially for women and children. At home, Gisela's role as mother and household manager evolved as her children reached adulthood. By the early 1890s, her eldest daughter Elisabeth was married into the Belgian royal family, and her other children began to assume their own public and private responsibilities. Gisela managed these transitions with characteristic order, facilitating introductions, arranging marriages, and ensuring that family assets were distributed according to established protocols. Contemporary accounts describe her household as disciplined, efficient, and a model of traditional aristocratic management. While Gisela's daily life maintained its established rhythm, the broader society of Munich and Bavaria faced considerable pressures. Industrialization brought rapid population growth and the expansion of urban infrastructure. New forms of social and political activism emerged, including movements advocating for labor rights, women's education, and expanded civic participation. Gisela's involvement in charitable work placed her in contact with the evolving needs of the city's residents, and her support for educational initiatives reflected an awareness of these changing circumstances. However, she continued to approach public engagement through the lens of duty and continuity, preferring gradual adaptation to abrupt change. The stability of Gisela's position during these decades was also reinforced by her careful navigation of the relationship between Bavarian and Habsburg interests. She maintained regular correspondence with her parents and surviving siblings, exchanged visits on significant family occasions, and sent gifts and letters marking religious and dynastic milestones. Official records from both Munich and Vienna describe her as a valued link between the two royal households, able to move comfortably within both spheres and to advocate for cooperation in social and charitable projects. Despite these continuities, the close of the 19th century brought new challenges for all European royals, including rising skepticism about the role of monarchy and growing public demands for reform. While some royal families responded with increased visibility or political engagement, Gisela remained consistent in her approach, prioritizing private responsibility and measured public service. Press coverage of the era often described her as a figure of stability and discretion, whose contributions were evident in the sustained operation of institutions she supported rather than in personal publicity or innovation. By the beginning of the 20th century, Gisela had secured her reputation as a principled and effective member of Munich society, rooted in the values of her upbringing but responsive to the evolving needs of the time. Her ability to maintain continuity amid transformation ensured that the charitable, religious, and familial structures she helped build would persist beyond her immediate influence. The close of the 19th century marked not a departure from established patterns, but a reaffirmation of Gisela's commitment to duty, serving as a foundation for the roles she would continue to play as Europe entered a new and uncertain age. On September 10, 1898, Empress Elisabeth of Austria was assassinated in Geneva by the Italian anarchist Luigi Lucchini, an event that immediately reverberated through European courts and shocked the Habsburg family. The news reached Munich within hours, conveyed by urgent telegram to Gisela and her husband Prince Leopold. The official announcement, followed by public proclamations and newspaper reports, ensured that both Bavaria and Austria entered a period of formal mourning. Gisela, as Elisabeth's only surviving daughter, was required to observe prescribed mourning customs and coordinate her own family's response in accordance with both Habsburg and Wittelsbach protocol. Archival correspondence from the late 1890s reveals Gisela's management of her household's observance of mourning, which included alterations to daily routines, the suspension of public events, and participation in religious services dedicated to her mother's memory. Letters exchanged between Gisela and her father, Emperor Franz Joseph I, show a measured exchange of condolences, logistical planning for funeral travel, and discussions about memorial arrangements. Gisela's role during these weeks was characterized by practicality and composure, as she facilitated travel for herself and her family to Vienna to attend the funeral and associated ceremonies. The funeral itself, held in Vienna, brought together the full spectrum of the imperial family, European royalty, and representatives of foreign governments. Gisela's participation in these events was documented in court registers and press accounts, which noted her presence at the Hofburg Palace, religious services at the Capuchin Church, and the interment at the imperial crypt. Contemporary reports emphasized the solemnity of the proceedings and the scale of the public outpouring of grief. Gisela's conduct was observed as dignified and reserved, consistent with the expectations for a princess of her standing. In the weeks and months following Elisabeth's assassination, the process of mythologizing the Empress began in earnest. The Viennese press and international newspapers produced extensive retrospectives on Elisabeth's life, focusing on her beauty, her independent spirit, and her tragic fate. Gisela's involvement in these narratives was limited. While acknowledged as Elisabeth's daughter, she was largely excluded from the personal stories and anecdotes that dominated public discussion. This marginalization reflected both the distant nature of their relationship and the preference for more dramatic or romanticized accounts of Elisabeth's life. Privately, Gisela addressed the immediate needs of her family and the obligations of her role in Bavaria. She managed the estate's finances, corresponded with relatives, and oversaw the continuation of charitable and civic projects despite the constraints of mourning. Letters from this period indicate that Gisela processed her mother's death through action rather than public demonstration of emotion. She authorized memorial donations in Elisabeth's name and continued to support causes that had been important to the Empress, including health and educational charities. Her approach to mourning emphasized continuity and duty, reinforcing the model of royal conduct she had practiced throughout her life. In the years that followed, the cult of Empress Elisabeth grew, with statues, poems, and commemorative events dedicated to her memory across Austria and beyond. Gisela's role in these efforts remained limited to formal participation, such as attending unveiling ceremonies or authorizing contributions. She neither promoted nor opposed the mythologizing of her mother's image, focusing instead on the practical matters of family, estate, and civic engagement. The public's fascination with Elisabeth only highlighted Gisela's peripheral position within the family's narrative. The assassination of Empress Elisabeth thus marked a turning point in both public memory and Gisela's private responsibilities. The dramatic circumstances of the Empress's death and the subsequent myth-making further obscured Gisela's role in the family history. However, archival evidence and contemporary accounts consistently describe her as a reliable and dignified presence, navigating the demands of mourning with composure and ensuring the continuation of her family's commitments during a period of heightened attention and change. The events of 1898 reinforced the patterns of duty and discretion that had come to define Gisela's historical identity. By the late 1890s, Gisela's attention had increasingly shifted to the management of her own household and the upbringing of her 4 children, Elisabeth Marie, Augusta Maria, Georg, and Conrad. As her children approached adolescence and adulthood, Gisela assumed responsibility for their education, social introduction, and eventual marriages, a process governed by established protocols within both the Bavarian and Habsburg royal traditions. Archival records, including correspondence with tutors, religious instructors, and extended family, reveal Gisella's careful oversight of her children's formative years and her commitment to providing them with the resources required by their rank. Education for the royal children reflected the standards of the era. Tutors specializing in languages, history, and the arts were engaged, while religious education remained central to the daily routine. Gisela insisted on discipline and attention to duty, but also allowed for a measure of personal development not always typical of her own childhood. Letters between Gisela and Prince Leopold during his military postings discuss the children's progress, academic achievements, and challenges, with Gisela providing regular updates and seeking input on key decisions. The children were introduced to the customs of court life through attendance at ceremonies, religious functions, and charitable events under their mother's supervision. By the turn of the 20th century, Gisela's eldest daughter, Elisabeth Marie, married Prince Otto of Windisch-Gratz, followed in subsequent years by the marriages of Auguste Maria, Georg, and Conrad, into families of comparable rank within the German and Austro-Hungarian nobility. The arrangements for these unions were detailed and complex, involving negotiations over dowries, property rights, and titles. Gisela corresponded extensively with her children's future in-laws, managing expectations on both sides and ensuring compliance with the legal and religious standards required by their respective houses. The process was further complicated by changes in the broader political landscape, including shifting alliances and the gradual erosion of royal influence in Central Europe. Within her own household, Gisela balanced her responsibilities as mother with her ongoing civic commitments. She maintained oversight of the family's financial affairs, managed staff, and ensured the smooth operation of the Munich residence. Household accounts and staff registers from the period document her attention to detail and her insistence on order and propriety. Social functions, while fewer than in earlier years, remained an important aspect of the family's public presence. Gisela hosted religious observances, charitable meetings, and occasional receptions, reinforcing her status as a leading figure in Munich's aristocratic society. The personal correspondence and diaries of Gisela's children offer glimpses into the family dynamic. Descriptions of their mother emphasize her practicality, discipline, and steady guidance. They acknowledge the distance imposed by court custom, but also record moments of warmth and private encouragement. Gisela's management style reflected her own upbringing, firm, predictable, and anchored in duty. Yet she also sought to avoid the emotional remoteness that had characterized her relationship with her own mother, Empress Elisabeth. Gisela's approach to motherhood and household management was shaped by the same principles that defined her public life: a reliance on established routines, attention to legal and social detail, and an emphasis on the values of service and continuity. She ensured her children were positioned for successful futures, adapted to the rapidly evolving context of European aristocracy, and maintained the traditions of her lineage while accommodating necessary change. By the time the First World War approached, Gisela's children were established in their own roles, and the family structure she had cultivated provided a foundation of stability in the face of uncertainty. This period of active motherhood and management not only defined Gisela's daily existence but also reinforced the long-term resilience of her household. Her strategies for balancing personal, familial, and public obligations served as a model within aristocratic circles and contributed to the preservation of the family's status during a time of profound transition for European royalty. With the outbreak of the First World War in the summer of 1914, Gisela's household, like many across Europe's royal families, confronted immediate and far-reaching changes. Prince Leopold, her husband, was recalled to active service in the Bavarian army, soon appointed to high command on the Eastern Front. This development required Gisela to manage the Munich household independently while maintaining regular correspondence with Leopold regarding family and administrative matters. Their exchanges, preserved in both private and official archives, provide insight into the rhythms of wartime family life. At the uppermost social echelon, Gisella's civic commitments intensified in the context of total war. The Bavarian Red Cross and local charitable institutions, already accustomed to her leadership, now looked to her for expanded support. Archival records from 1914 through 1918 document Gisella's active engagement with hospital committees, military supply drives, and emergency relief for wounded soldiers and displaced families. She oversaw the transformation of royal properties into auxiliary hospitals and directed the work of volunteers, many of whom were drawn from Munich's aristocracy and professional classes. City council minutes and Red Cross bulletins record her attendance at strategic planning meetings and her role in public appeals for donations and assistance. Within her family, Gisella faced the challenge of divided loyalties and uncertainty about the future. Her children's marriages had connected them to multiple branches of Europe's nobility, some with allegiances that crossed the lines of conflict. Letters and reports from the period revealed Gisella's concern for her children's safety and the practical arrangements needed to keep extended family members informed and protected. She continued to emphasize education and discipline for her younger children and grandchildren, while offering support and advice to those whose spouses or relatives served in the armed forces. Daily life in Munich during wartime became marked by shortages, restrictions, and the ongoing threat of violence. Gisella managed household resources with heightened attention to efficiency, adapting menus, conserving fuel, and directing staff to support the city's broader relief efforts. Household accounts reflect the reallocation of funds to public charities and the repurposing of domestic spaces for use by wounded soldiers or displaced civilians. Through it all, Gisella maintained a steady correspondence with friends and family in Austria and beyond, sharing news, practical advice, and words of comfort. The demands of public representation also intensified. Gisella attended commemorative services, distributed awards to volunteers and military personnel, and hosted modest gatherings for officials overseeing relief operations. Press reports during the war years describe her as dignified and steadfast, refraining from displays of personal emotion while upholding the expected standards of royal conduct. She became a symbol of disciplined service in a city struggling with the realities of modern conflict. Her leadership, widely recognized, but always presented in a tone of collective effort rather than individual heroism. By the end of 1918, the impact of the First World War had permanently altered the landscape for Europe's monarchies. Gisella's family, like many others, faced the dissolution of empire, the loss of formal privilege, and the uncertainty of life under new political regimes. Yet her approach during these years, marked by resilience, adaptability, and an unwavering commitment to service, ensured that the structures she managed did not collapse in the face of crisis. The experience of war reinforced the importance of the values that had defined her upbringing and her adult life, providing a foundation for the difficult transitions that lay ahead for her family and for the remnants of the old order. As the First World War reached its conclusion in late 1918, the European political order experienced its most sweeping transformation in generations. The Habsburg and Wittelsbach monarchies, long-standing pillars of Central Europe, were abolished in the course of revolutionary upheavals that followed the armistice. For Gisella and her family, these changes were immediate and consequential. On November 7, 1918, King Ludwig III of Bavaria fled Munich ahead of revolutionary crowds. The monarchy's formal end was declared in the days that followed, mirroring the events that brought the Habsburg Empire to its dissolution, with Emperor Karl's abdication in Austria. Official records from this period, including government decrees and city council proclamations, document the revocation of royal privileges, the confiscation or reallocation of properties, and the imposition of new restrictions on former members of the nobility. Gisella, as Princess Leopold of Bavaria, lost legal recognition of her title and much of the income derived from crown estates. The Munich residence, though retained as a private property after negotiations, now operated without the support structure previously provided by the royal administration. Correspondence between Gisela and city officials details the practical arrangements required to transition to a new status, including the renegotiation of taxes, property rights, and access to public utilities. Within the household, the atmosphere shifted rapidly. Staff levels were reduced, budgets reevaluated, and ceremonial routines either ended or adapted to private forms. Gisela took the lead in managing these adjustments, applying the organizational skills and discipline that had defined her earlier roles. Household records indicate careful prioritization of expenses and the redirection of family resources to essential needs. Social obligations diminished and the scope of family gatherings became more limited, with an emphasis on maintaining internal cohesion rather than public display. The loss of formal position extended to Gisela's public activities. Institutions that had once relied upon royal patronage now faced their own existential crises, as funding diminished and the symbolic presence of the monarchy disappeared from official events. Gisela continued to support select charities and civic organizations, though now as a private citizen. The minutes of several boards and societies record her continued, if less visible, participation, emphasizing a spirit of continuity even as institutional frameworks changed. Her involvement was appreciated by those familiar with her record, but the absence of official recognition meant that her contributions were increasingly overshadowed by the demands of a new political era. Family correspondence and personal diaries from 1918 and 1919 reveal the psychological impact of these changes. Gisela expressed concern for her children and grandchildren, who faced uncertainty regarding inheritance, education, and marriage prospects in a republic where noble lineage no longer conferred security or privilege. She provided guidance on adapting to new circumstances, advocating for practical skills and financial caution. The tone of her communications reflected both resilience and realism, avoiding nostalgia for the past while acknowledging the challenges inherent in the transition. In Munich, the aftermath of revolution brought both disruption and gradual normalization. Gisela's continued residence in the city allowed her to maintain connections with local officials, religious leaders, and the shrinking community of former aristocrats. Her discreet approach, honed over decades of public and private duty, served her well in an environment where overt displays of royal allegiance were discouraged or even prohibited. Contemporary press coverage of her activities declined sharply, but occasional mentions described her as a figure of stability during a period of uncertainty. By the early 1920s, the consequences of monarchy's collapse had become a defining feature of Gisela's life. The privileges and structures that had shaped her existence from birth were gone, replaced by a set of challenges that demanded adaptability, discretion, and persistence. Yet the habits of order and responsibility established in earlier years allowed her to manage the transition with composure. The fall of the monarchies marked an end to an era, but for Gisela, it was also the beginning of a new chapter in which personal resourcefulness and continuity assumed new significance. By the early 1920s, Gisela had adjusted to the new reality of life as a private citizen in the Bavarian capital. The collapse of the monarchy brought an end to her official titles, privileges, and ceremonial duties, but it did not erase her sense of obligation to family and community. Archival letters and household records from the period illustrate her methodical approach to the challenges of Republican society, including the reorganization of family finances, property management, and a continued, if quieter, role in charitable organizations. In the first years following the revolution, the financial security of former royal families was far from assured. Gisela managed the family's remaining assets with care, negotiating with tax authorities and city officials to secure her Munich residence and ensure a basic standard of living for her immediate household. Staff numbers were reduced further, and expenditures carefully tracked. Detailed accounts show her direct involvement in budgeting, procurement, and maintenance decisions, reflecting a level of administrative oversight that paralleled her earlier experience, running a royal household, but now with fewer resources and no institutional safety net. The new republic discouraged overt displays of aristocratic identity, but Gisela maintained private correspondence with members of the former nobility and relatives scattered across post-imperial Europe. Letters exchanged with cousins in Austria, Hungary, and Belgium discuss strategies for adapting to shifting laws regarding property, inheritance, and social standing. Through these networks, Gisela and her peers shared practical advice on legal matters, security concerns, and the establishment of charitable trusts to support family members in need. While Gisela's public profile diminished, her commitment to civic duty persisted. She continued to serve on the boards of hospitals and religious charities, often under her family name, rather than her former title. Institutional records from the 1920s note her ongoing participation, particularly in support of children's health, church welfare programs, and local initiatives to aid the poor. Her practical involvement and financial contributions, though more modest than in previous decades, were valued by colleagues and beneficiaries who remembered her earlier leadership. By avoiding political controversy and maintaining a focus on service, Gisela preserved a degree of influence and respect in her adopted city. Within her own family, Gisela's role as matriarch became more pronounced. She provided advice and assistance to her children and grandchildren as they pursued careers, education, or new family alliances in a Europe that no longer revolved around royal lineage. Her approach was pragmatic, emphasizing adaptability, the pursuit of professional skills, and the careful management of remaining resources. Family gatherings, while less formal and smaller in scale, remained important, with Gisela ensuring that religious observances, celebrations, and milestones were marked according to tradition. The challenges of post-war Munich, including inflation, political unrest, and the rise of new ideologies, did not spare Gisela's circle. The family weathered periods of scarcity by relying on established habits of thrift and cooperation, guided by her example. Her resilience during this period is documented in the correspondence of contemporaries, who describe her as calm and composed even as the security and status she once knew receded further into the past. By the end of the 1920s, Gisela's ability to adapt had ensured the survival and relative stability of her household in a radically changed world. Her strategies, combining personal discipline, community service, and quiet perseverance, offered a model to others navigating the uncertainties of life after monarchy. In the Republic, her identity was no longer defined by title, but by the habits of responsibility and discretion that had shaped her entire life, setting the stage for the next phase of adaptation in the face of further change. During the 1920s and into the early 1930s, Gisela's daily existence in Munich was marked by both external uncertainty and an enduring commitment to the values and routines that had long shaped her identity. The interwar period brought waves of political instability, hyperinflation, and social transformation throughout Germany. For former members of the nobility, the environment demanded constant adaptation to shifting regulations and changing public sentiment. Archival evidence, including property records, correspondence, and institutional minutes, demonstrates how Gisela navigated these conditions by relying on discipline, discretion, and careful stewardship of her household. Despite the constraints imposed by the loss of royal status, Gisela maintained her residence in Munich and preserved key family traditions. She continued to host small religious observances, sponsor charitable events in partnership with local churches, and mark family milestones in private gatherings. Church registers and family diaries from the period confirm her steady presence at religious services, her contributions to parish projects, and her encouragement of younger relatives to maintain ties with faith and community. Gisela's approach avoided any hint of nostalgia or open defiance of the Republican order. Instead, she focused on continuity, preserving what could be maintained and quietly letting go of what no longer served her family's interests. Financial prudence became essential as the German economy lurched from crisis to crisis. Gisela worked closely with her adult children to manage budgets, liquidate unnecessary assets, and ensure that essential needs were met. household accounts, and legal documents from the period reveal careful decisions about property sales, investments, and the employment of staff. Gisela's correspondence shows a willingness to seek legal and financial advice, and a determination to avoid the more dramatic reversals of fortune experienced by some of her peers. Civic and charitable engagement, though less visible than in previous decades, remained central to Gisela's sense of purpose. Institutional records indicate her ongoing involvement in local hospitals and church-based welfare programs. Even as her capacity for direct leadership diminished with age, she became a figure of continuity for organizations that had lost their royal patrons, offering experience and counsel to new generations of volunteers and administrators. In this role, Gisela exemplified a quiet, persistent form of service that outlasted the ceremonies and public accolades of her earlier life. Within her immediate family, Gisela maintained a unifying presence. She encouraged education, adaptability, and professional advancement for her grandchildren, emphasizing the importance of personal merit in a world no longer organized by hereditary privilege. Family letters and photographs from the era depict intimate gatherings, shared meals, and celebrations that, while reduced in scale, retained a sense of dignity and order. Her insistence on religious observance, mutual support, and careful stewardship created a stable foundation amid external upheaval. As political tensions rose across Germany in the late 1920s, culminating in the emergence of new and often hostile ideologies, Gisela maintained a deliberate distance from public controversy. She restricted her comments to close confidants and family, focusing on the practical measures necessary to protect household security and community relationships. By adhering to a policy of non-confrontation and steady commitment to service, Gisela avoided entanglement in the divisive politics of the era. The interwar years thus stand as a testament to Gisela's capacity for adaptation and leadership under constraint. Her careful balance of tradition and pragmatism enabled her to preserve the core values of her family, provide stability for those who depended on her, and maintain a measure of respect within a society rapidly discarding the old order. The foundation she established during this period would prove vital as new challenges, both personal and political, arose in the years to follow. As Europe moved toward renewed conflict in the late 1930s, Gisela, now in her 80s, faced the prospect of war once more. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 brought immediate challenges to daily life in Munich, compounding the sense of disruption that had defined the interwar period. Though her role was no longer public or ceremonial, Gisela maintained a quiet but consistent presence within her family and the networks of support she had established over previous decades. Household correspondence, legal records, and diaries from the 1940s document the series of adjustments required to sustain domestic stability in wartime. Gisela managed a greatly reduced staff, directed household resources with strict economy, and prioritized the security of her remaining family members. Food shortages, air raid warnings, and the threat of requisition placed constant pressure on the management of even basic routines. Despite these obstacles, Gisela ensured that religious observances continued within the home, that birthdays and holidays were recognized, and that bonds of kinship were sustained in the face of separation and uncertainty. Many of Gisela's grandchildren and extended relatives experienced the war in different ways, some as civilians facing displacement, others as military personnel or medical volunteers. Letters and reports from this period indicate that Gisela provided both material assistance and emotional support wherever possible. She arranged for the safe relocation of younger family members to rural areas, offered guidance on maintaining essential records, and supported charitable appeals through church and hospital networks. Her prior experience managing transitions during the First World War and the Republican Revolution served her well in this period of renewed crisis. Though direct involvement in civic organizations had become impossible, Gisela's reputation for service and reliability endured. Church leaders and former associates continued to seek her counsel on matters of charitable distribution and community support. Parish bulletins from Munich mention her contributions to relief funds and the discreet donations she made to assist families affected by bombing or economic hardship. These actions, though less visible than her earlier leadership roles, reflected a continued commitment to practical help over ceremonial recognition. The ongoing violence of war, including air raids on Munich and the destruction of familiar neighborhoods, took a toll on household stability and family communications. Records show frequent disruptions to mail service, shortages of critical supplies, and the necessity for improvised solutions to everyday problems. Gisela responded to these difficulties with the same habits of resourcefulness, discretion, and order that had guided her through earlier periods of upheaval. Her letters to family members emphasized the importance of patience, mutual support, and the maintenance of religious and moral values despite adversity. Throughout the Second World War, Gisela's advanced age required her to rely increasingly on trusted relatives and longtime staff for the execution of daily tasks. Nevertheless, she retained overall authority in the household and continued to monitor developments affecting the family in the city. She remained in regular contact with clergy, medical professionals, and local officials, ensuring that her household's needs were met and that her modest resources were used effectively for the benefit of others. By the end of the conflict in 1945, Munich lay in ruins, and the German social order had been transformed yet again. Gisela's survival and continued presence in the city provided a symbol of endurance for her family, and for those who remembered her service in earlier decades. The habits of discipline, resilience, and community engagement that she demonstrated during these years would serve as a reference point for post-war recovery efforts, reinforcing the importance of continuity and quiet support in times of profound disruption. In the aftermath of the Second World War, Munich was left scarred by destruction and marked by the disarray of a city adjusting to occupation, food shortages, and the dissolution of previous social structures. Gisela, approaching her 90th year, remained at the Munich residence she had maintained through decades of change. Family correspondence and local records from the late 1940s provide insight into her efforts to re-establish a sense of order and stability for her household and surviving relatives during a period characterized by displacement and uncertainty. Rebuilding daily life after the war required significant adaptation. Gisela supervised repairs to the family residence, organized the retrieval of essential records, and coordinated with city authorities to restore basic utilities. With staff numbers further reduced, she relied on the assistance of adult grandchildren and loyal retainers. Her skills in budget management, refined over decades of enforced thrift, became essential in navigating the shortages of food and household supplies that persisted throughout the immediate post-war years. Gisela's commitment to family continuity was evident in her support for younger relatives whose lives had been disrupted by the war. She facilitated educational placements, offered temporary housing, and provided references for employment where possible. Family letters indicate that she encouraged professional training and adaptation to new social realities, recognizing that hereditary status offered little advantage in the rapidly changing conditions of post-war Germany. Her role as matriarch, though less visible outside the family circle, became more significant as younger generations sought her counsel on matters of finance, property, and personal conduct. Charitable engagement, though limited by personal circumstances, continued to be a feature of Gisela's daily life. She contributed to church relief funds, participated in parish drives for the needy, and remained in regular contact with religious leaders who coordinated local efforts to aid those most affected by wartime destruction. Records from Munich parishes and hospitals document small but regular donations made in her name and her willingness to serve as an advisor in efforts to re-establish charitable societies previously dependent on royal patronage. The broader context of Munich's recovery included the influx of refugees, the reorganization of city government under Allied supervision, and the gradual return to civilian administration. Gisela's approach was cautious and measured, emphasizing the maintenance of household order and the prudent use of limited resources. She avoided public commentary on political developments, maintaining the discretion that had become her hallmark over a lifetime of adaptation to changing regimes. Despite her declining health, Gisela took an active interest in family history, correspondence, and the preservation of records documenting both Habsburg and Wittelsbach lineage. Letters and notes from the period show her efforts to compile family archives, record genealogies, and ensure that future generations would retain access to documentation of their origins and experiences. This activity reflected both personal inclination and a sense of responsibility for continuity amid loss. By the end of the 1940s, the routines of daily life in the Munich household reflected a new reality, marked by recovery rather than restoration. Gisela's capacity to adapt, provide guidance, and preserve traditions established a foundation for her descendants, ensuring the family's survival as Munich and Germany itself embarked on a path toward reconstruction and eventual prosperity. The closing years of Gisela's life bore witness to the endurance of values and practices that had shaped her since childhood, providing stability and purpose amid the uncertainties of the post-war world. During the late 1940s and into the early 1930s, Gisela's role within her family and immediate social circle became increasingly defined by reflection, record-keeping, and gradual withdrawal from public engagement. Her health, already weakened by age, and the rigors of the Second World War and its aftermath, limited her ability to participate in even the small-scale charitable and social functions that had continued during the early post-war period. Family letters, visitor logs, and medical records from these years offer insight into her daily life, characterized by regular but brief interactions with children, grandchildren, and trusted confidants. Gisela continued to occupy her residence in Munich, which remained a point of contact for family members scattered across Germany and Austria. Visits were often brief, focused on family matters, the exchange of news, and the review of inherited documents and correspondence. With many of her contemporaries gone, Gisela's correspondence shifted toward sharing memories, consolidating family stories, and organizing personal papers for future generations. Several surviving letters to distant cousins and grandchildren reveal her efforts to transmit genealogical knowledge, clarify the events of earlier decades, and encourage the responsible stewardship of what remained of family possessions and traditions. The emphasis on reflection extended to Gisela's religious practice, which became more private and contemplative with age. Diaries and notes from her household confirm her daily routine of prayer and the regular attendance of clergy for sacraments and counsel. The diminished scale of her household did not alter the continuation of religious observance. This, a constant throughout her life, and a source of comfort during her final years. Gisela maintained a steady commitment to modest charitable giving, with parish records noting her final contributions to local relief funds and memorial foundations. Medical accounts from the period describe a gradual physical decline, accompanied by intermittent periods of lucidity and increased fatigue. Gisela relied on the care of trusted nurses and the support of family members who managed the practical affairs of the household. As her world became more circumscribed, she took satisfaction in maintaining control over her immediate environment and ensuring the orderly transfer of responsibility to her successors. Family members and visitors consistently remarked upon her calm demeanor and the clarity with which she recounted her experiences and lessons learned. The closing chapter of Gisela's life was marked not by dramatic developments, but by a sustained pattern of quiet resilience and responsibility. She continued to respond to correspondence, receive visitors, and manage what remained of her personal affairs until her final months. In her conversations and letters, she avoided nostalgia and focused instead on the future of her family, offering guidance that reflected the habits of discipline and foresight cultivated over nearly a century. Gisela died on July 27, 1932, at her residence in Munich. The event was recorded in family archives and church registers, noted with respectful brevity in local press, and acknowledged by a small circle of surviving relatives and associates. Her funeral, conducted according to the rites of the Catholic Church, was a private occasion, attended by family and a handful of former colleagues. With her passing, an era of adaptation, perseverance, and understated influence within the Habsburg and Wittelsbach legacies quietly concluded, leaving behind a pattern of resilience and practical wisdom for those who would inherit her memory. In the years following Gisella's death in the summer of 1932, commemoration of her life and legacy unfolded largely within the boundaries of private family memory and the institutional circles she had served. Unlike her mother, Empress Elisabeth, whose assassination in the late 19th century generated a widespread public cult and enduring myth, Gisella's passing was marked by discreet ceremonies and measured acknowledgments. Family correspondence, parish records, and institutional archives from the 1930s and 1940s document the practical and commemorative steps taken by relatives and former colleagues. Immediately after her death, Gisella's residence in Munich became the site of small gatherings of family and close associates, who organized her funeral and arranged for the orderly disposition of her personal effects. The event was noted in the Catholic press and recorded in local church registers, but did not draw significant public attention. Memorial donations were made in her name to hospitals and religious charities with which she had been associated for decades. Letters of condolence arrived from relatives in Austria, Belgium, and Hungary, reflecting the continuing connections between branches of the former royal houses of Europe. Over the ensuing years, memorialization of Gisella's life continued primarily through acts of charity and the maintenance of family traditions. Her descendants preserved photographs, correspondence, and official documents, adding to genealogical records and family archives. In religious communities, Gisella's support for local parishes and health institutions was remembered in annual reports and occasionally referenced at commemorative services. The directors of several Munich hospitals and orphanages made note of her enduring impact on fundraising and policy, citing her as an example of disciplined, practical service during periods of transition and crisis. Public recognition of Gisella's life remained limited, a fact noted by historians examining the broader process of constructing Habsburg memory in the 20th century. While biographies and memorials to her mother and brother were published in Austria and beyond, Gisella was typically referenced in the context of her family relationships or as an adjunct to more dramatic historical events. Institutional histories of the Red Cross, Munich charities, and regional hospitals occasionally mentioned her administrative and financial contributions, but few efforts were made to elevate her personal narrative beyond specialist circles. By the post-war period, commemorative practices centered almost entirely on the family. Anniversaries of her birth and death were observed with private masses, small gatherings, and acts of remembrance at grave sites and family chapels. The resilience and organizational skill she demonstrated during periods of crisis continued to be referenced in oral tradition and family correspondence. Researchers seeking to reconstruct the lived experience of Habsburg women in the 19th and 20th centuries increasingly relied on the surviving documents, photographs, and institutional records preserved by her descendants. Gisella's commemoration thus provides a case study in the ways historical memory is shaped by both public narrative and private stewardship. Her story stands as a reminder that the enduring impact of royal women often resided not in public spectacle, but in the preservation of continuity, the quiet management of change, and the cultivation of values and habits that survived even as dynasties fell and political systems shifted. The practical legacies of her life, preserved in family tradition and local institutions, persisted as tangible links to a world transformed by revolution, war, and recovery. By the middle of the 20th century, the study of the Habsburg dynasty increasingly moved beyond the grand narratives of emperors, wars, and political decline to encompass the quieter, often overlooked contributions of royal women. Archival research, family records, and institutional histories reveal that figures like Gisella embodied a form of dynastic endurance, built on duty, discretion, and adaptability. Within this broader historiographical trend, Gisella's life illustrates how women at the margins of public attention played essential roles in maintaining family cohesion, supporting charitable networks, and managing transitions during eras of upheaval. Historians examining the Habsburg legacy in the decades after the World Wars have highlighted the structural realities that shaped the experience of imperial daughters. Unlike male heirs, whose education and public roles centered on political authority, women were prepared from an early age for the practical and emotional management of households, estates, and kinship networks. Gisela's upbringing, characterized by discipline, limited parental contact, and early adaptation to ceremony, was mirrored in the lives of her contemporaries across European royal families. Her subsequent marriage into the Wittelsbach house and the management of her Bavarian household reflected the ways dynastic women facilitated alliances and local stability through personal conduct and organizational skill. Within Munich and the surrounding region, Gisela's legacy was sustained not by monuments or public celebrations, but by the continued functioning of the charitable and religious institutions she supported. Administrative records from hospitals, orphanages, and church boards from the 1930s through the 1950s reference her methods of oversight and the precedents she established in financial management and staff training. Her approach to civic engagement centered on continuity rather than innovation proved durable as these organizations navigated the social and economic dislocations of the post-war era. Gisela's influence also persisted through the habits and routines she instilled in her descendants. Family accounts, preserved letters, and oral history interviews indicate that her emphasis on discretion, thrift, and adaptability remained guiding principles for younger generations, adjusting to life in Republican Germany and Austria. The focus on education, professionalism, and community service as substitutes for hereditary status enabled members of her family to navigate the decline of formal privilege without forfeiting a sense of identity or purpose. In scholarly studies of the Habsburg women, published in the second half of the 20th century, Gisela's example became part of a broader reassessment of gender, family, and institutional continuity in modern European history. Researchers pointed to her career as evidence that the preservation of dynastic influence did not depend solely on political visibility, but also on the routines of management, caregiving, and adaptation enacted in domestic and local contexts. The silent legacy left by figures like Gisela provided the scaffolding for more visible royal activities and helped sustain networks of support across periods of disruption and loss. By the end of the century, the restoration of family archives and renewed interest in women's history had brought further attention to the significance of Gisela's life. Public exhibitions, academic conferences, and genealogical research projects incorporated her records and correspondence, highlighting the breadth of her responsibilities and the scope of her influence. These developments signaled a more nuanced understanding of the Habsburg legacy, one that recognized the essential roles played by women who, though less visible in traditional narratives, ensured the survival and adaptation of the dynasty through times of dramatic change. Archduchess Gisela's life, lived at the edge of great historical events, underscores the complexity and diversity within the Habsburg dynasty. Unlike her mother and brother, whose stories became symbols of imperial drama and tragedy, Gisela's legacy lies in her steady adaptation to changing circumstances, her quiet service, and her commitment to family and community. Her experience demonstrates the varied paths available within royal families, particularly for women whose contributions were often overlooked. Gisela's story remains a valuable case study in the endurance of personal responsibility amid the transformations of 19th and 20th century Europe. The memory of her pragmatic approach and understated influence continues to inform our understanding of an era marked by both continuity and change.